Hey guys, welcome to the next section of the video. I would like to start this section by briefly overviewing the two main ideas that we talked about before. The first of those being that through nature there is an inherent connection between art and engineering, although that connection is not matched in society. The second big idea that we talked about is the idea that there's a growing and increasingly more problematic separation between society and nature. So, with these two ideas, and with my desire to create a new image for the engineer in America, I developed the following research questions. How can we establish a stronger connection between art and engineering in order to respect nature and create a more humane structure for society and culture? And to address this research question, I began doing lots of research. And what I was looking for were really the contextual elements that create and define the engineer's identity in America. And after doing my research, I came up with three primary contextual influences, which I feel accurately define and then ultimately constrain the American engineer. The first of these that we'd like to talk about is the idea that engineering culture is a dominating culture as opposed to a cooperative culture. So dominating, controlling, ruling, governing, direct versus cooperation, collaborating, combining forces, working together, assisting. And the engineer works in this thought paradigm here of domination. And we can see this very early in American history with the idea of manifest destiny. The idea that it is our right to move across the American landscape, to conquer the American landscape for the purpose of our own prosperity and growth. And the engineer, we can talk about his building of the canal systems and changing the natural water situation on our continent in order to suit our own needs. Additionally, we have the imagery of that time of the railroad cutting through the American landscape and overcoming the natural constraints of time and space as they were understood at that time. And another great example that I love is from the 1850s and 1860s, when the entire city of Chicago was raised up as much as 6 feet in order to address the water flow issues the city was having because of its location so low near to Lake Michigan. And this touches on the concepts we talked about in the previous section of societies growing and advancing and then raising themselves above the constraints of nature. So really a great example there. I think it's pretty cool. And this cultural dominating mentality, we can talk about it again in relation to the Cold War. And during this time, we had the race to space, to build the atomic bomb, the push to get more students into science and technology fields. And all of this, we need to realize, is occurring under the context of the United States seeking to establish its own dominance over the USSR, over another political institution. So again, the goal of dominating, of superiority. And then finally we have engineers like Robert Moses. And he was able to use the physical structure of his design to create a form of social order. So with the roadway that he built overpasses such that wealthy, primarily white citizens who owned their cars were able to utilize his road and get to the beach where it led. However, buses, public transportation, those citizens who could not afford their own car, lower income citizens, primarily minorities, could not use this road. The buses could not get through. So in this way, Robert Moses was able to use his physical structure to create a form of social order and social inequality. And this whole evolution of domination is summed up very well by Sandra Harding in her article, The Science Question in Women, the women question in science and the science question in feminism. There we go. And what she said was that we can now see that the hope to dominate nature for the betterment of our species has become an effort to gain unequal access to nature's resources for the purpose of social domination. Really wraps that up very cleanly. So the next thing in this category that I want to discuss is the context of the engineer in a white patriarchal society. And within this society, the engineer fits the role of the dominant male. Logically so, engineering is dominated by men. Has been throughout history, although more women are introduced, it still is a male-dominated field. And so the engineering mentality embodies the value systems of a white patriarchal society, the male value systems. Therefore, so too do the designs, as well as society, in a very cyclical way, reflect those same values. And the last point of discussion here is from feminist theory. And within feminist theory, the female is seen as closely related to nature, and the male is viewed as closely related to culture. And so, looking at this in our white patriarchal social structure, we know that the male dominates over female, culture dominates over nature, and therefore engineering culture as well dominates over nature. So I think we've established this idea of domination pretty well, and the problem is that domination as an organizing principle works to fracture the natural systems of our environment. And by doing this, we ultimately only create more problems that we then have to solve, more environmental issues that we have to solve, which everyone I'm sure is very familiar with and sick of hearing about. And the other thing that domination as an organizing principle does is that it perpetuates a state of social inequality. So it perpetuates the idea of the dominant male, this non-dominant female, dominant culture, nature is dominated over. It really pushes that idea. And so from this section, the big take-home message is that we can no longer afford to continue using domination as our principal organizing tool. It's just not good. We need something else. So that is our first big contextual element that we're going to talk about. The next thing that I want to discuss is the economic, political context of the engineer in America in a very capitalistic climate. And especially during the Industrial Revolution in the 18th, the 19th, and 20th centuries, we saw capitalism really ruled all. And because of capitalism, our society and our engineers have very specific definitions for things like efficiency, progress, and improvement. The result of this is that the engineer is ultimately limited in the types of efficiency, progress, and improvement he can achieve because of his singular, narrow-minded definitions of those ideas. Next, and the last contextual influence that we have is the engineering education system in America. And the first thing that we have here is that our American engineering system, education system, was derived from the French and British models, both of which notably come out of white patriarchal societies. And as America developed its own engineering educational identity, there are three main issues at play that I feel really pertain to the discussion we're having. The first of those is that engineering education is a highly technical, theory-based practice. And so textbook knowledge, principles of motion, laws of motion, very technical, very theory-based. What it is not is very experimental. And like the traditional British system of engineering education was very much based on trial and error, on experience and apprenticeship, and we don't see that translating much into the modern education of an engineer. As we did with the French tradition of the very technical, theory-based textbook study. And the last component we have here is that the engineering education contains very little cultural information. The engineers are well trained in their thermodynamics, in their statics, in design, in all of these things, but what the engineer doesn't learn about is about culture and about society. And because of this, the engineer is unable to understand how his technologies and his creations go out and affect society. Similarly, he cannot conceptualize the way in which society and the social structure affect his problem-solving approach and that influence his problem-solving approach and affect the designs that he creates. And because of these distinctive characteristics of engineering education, we have another issue, and that is the over-rationalization of everything, of human experience, that everything can be explained by an algorithm, by an equation, by a principle. And the result of this is that individuality is lost to generality, and the peculiar, the unique, is lost to the generic. So, not the best. And through these three primary contextual influences, America has created one distinct image among infinite possibilities of what it means to be an engineer. And because of this very specific engineering paradigm, the engineer today is very aptly suited for addressing a specific type of problem in a very specific type of way. And this prevents him from having a truly dynamic problem-solving approach. And our contexts are changing, our situation is changing. We have, earlier in our history, we had goals of capitalistic expansion, of domination. And I think that the ideas, the goals today have changed. Today we seek things like community development and global cooperation to address global issues, and sustainability, and creating a more equal structure for society. And with these new goals in mind, we really do need a new approach to problem solving, because we do not need a continuation of past progress. The way that we've made progress in the past is not the way we need to continue making progress. That progress has resulted in a fractured environment and in an unequal society. And so what I believe we need is the commencement of a new era and a new definition for progress. That's the really big idea here, is that the issues that we are confronted with today cannot be addressed by the engineer that we have today. He has been historically and culturally raised in a climate that does not make him well suited to address the types of issues that are concerned today. And so, all of this brings me back to my original research question, which notably was developed through many, many iterations as I went through this research process. And so again, we have the idea of how can we establish a stronger connection between art and engineering for the purpose of respecting nature and building a more humane structure for society and culture. And what this research question is really trying to get after is the idea of how an engineering education and engineering culture could be supplemented by an artistic perspective, an artistic mentality, in order to give the engineer the tools he needs to address the more complex and dynamic problems that we face today. So, that is where I will leave you for this section of the video, and in a few seconds, we will talk a little bit more about this idea.